Blackwells Open Heart.
France, 1918.
Nurse Evelyn Carter pressed a bandage against Captain James Calloway's wound, expecting the usual flow of blood. But nothing came. His skin was warm, his pulse steady, but his injury, deep as it was, looked weeks old instead of fresh. He opened his eyes and gripped her wrist. "You weren't supposed to see that." Chapter 1. The Impossible Wound. The air in the field hospital was thick with the cloying sweetness of antiseptic, overlaid with the coppery tang of blood and the ever-present, underlying scent of damp earth and decay. Evelyn Carter moved through the rows of cots with a practiced efficiency, her starched white uniform a stark contrast to the mud-caked khaki and olive drab that surrounded her. The relentless drone of artillery fire was a distant, but constant, reminder of the war raging just beyond the canvas walls. Another wave of wounded had arrived from the front, and the already strained resources of the small French village hospital were stretched to their breaking point. Evelyn paused beside a newly arrived patient, a captain, judging by the insignia barely visible beneath the grime on his uniform. His face was pale, streaked with mud, but his eyes were closed, his breathing surprisingly even for a man with such a grievous wound. The field dressing hastily applied to his side was soaked, not with the fresh, bright red she expected, but with a darker, almost brownish stain. It looked old. "Captain?" she murmured, gently touching his shoulder. He didn't stir. With a sigh, she reached for the scissors tucked into her apron pocket and began to carefully cut away the fabric of his uniform, revealing the makeshift bandage beneath. The air caught in her throat. The wound was a deep, ragged tear in his flesh, the kind inflicted by shrapnel or a bayonet. It should have been gushing blood, yet it wasn't. The edges were strangely clean, almost healed. It looked like a wound days, perhaps even weeks, old, not mere hours. A chill prickled her skin. This was impossible. Carefully, she peeled back the blood-soaked cloth. The skin beneath was smooth, pale, but undeniably intact. Where the gaping wound had been, there was only a faint, silvery line, like an old scar. Evelyn's fingers trembled as she reached out, her fingertips brushing the strange, smooth skin. It was warm, the pulse beneath her fingers steady and strong. He opened his eyes. They were the color of deep sea on a stormy day, intense and unsettling. He stared at her, a flicker of something that might have been panic crossing his features, before his gaze shifted to her hand, still resting on his side. He gripped her wrist, his fingers surprisingly strong. "You weren't supposed to see that," he said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. Evelyn tried to pull her hand away, but his grip tightened. It wasn't painful, but it was undeniably firm. "Captain, you're wounded," she stammered, unable to articulate the impossibility of what she had just witnessed. "It's nothing," he said, his gaze locking with hers. "A scratch. I heal quickly." The lie was blatant, absurd. Evelyn had seen enough injuries in her 3 years as a nurse to know that what she had just seen defied all medical understanding. Men didn't heal from wounds like that in hours. They didn't heal from wounds like that at all. "Captain Calloway," she said, using the name she'd glimpsed on his partially obscured identification tag, "I need to examine you properly. There may be internal injuries." He shook his head, his eyes still holding hers captive. "There's nothing wrong with me. I need to get back to my men." "Back to your men?" Evelyn echoed, incredulous. "You were brought in unconscious. You have a wound that shouldn't be possible." A flicker of something regret? Resignation? Crossed his face. He released her wrist, and Evelyn, almost involuntarily, drew her hand back, clutching it to her chest. "I assure you, nurse," he paused, searching for her name. "Carter," she supplied, her voice steadier now, though her heart was still pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "Evelyn Carter." "Nurse Carter," he repeated, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. "I appreciate your concern, but I am perfectly well. I need to return to my unit." The fighting he trailed off, his gaze drifting towards the entrance of the tent, as if he could see through the canvas to the battlefield beyond. Evelyn knew she should insist. She should call for the doctor, alert the other nurses. This man was clearly different. But something in his eyes, a deep, unsettling weariness, held her back. It was the look of a man who had seen too much, endured too much, and was carrying a burden far heavier than any physical wound. Another explosion, closer this time, rattled the tent. A young soldier on a nearby cot cried out in pain, his voice raw with fear. Evelyn glanced at him, then back at Captain Calloway. The decision was made for her. "I'll get you some clean bandages," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And some water. But you must stay here.
Rest.
At least until the doctor can see you." He nodded, his gaze softening slightly. "Thank you, Nurse Carter." Evelyn turned away, her mind racing. She retrieved the supplies, her hands moving automatically, her thoughts consumed by the impossible wound and the strange, unsettling eyes of the captain. As she returned to his cot, she saw him watching her, a faint, enigmatic smile playing on his lips. He seemed to know something she didn't, a secret that lay hidden beneath his skin, beneath the scars of war. And as she rebandaged the area where the impossible wound had been, she knew that her life, her understanding of the world, had irrevocably changed. The air shifted slightly. A new group of wounded arrived, and the scent of fresh blood briefly overcame that of the old. Chapter 2. Whispers in the Ward. The following hours were a blur of activity. Evelyn moved from patient to patient, tending to shattered limbs, burns, and the myriad horrors that war inflicted upon the human body. But even as she worked, her mind kept returning to Captain Calloway. She had managed to convince him to remain in the hospital, at least for the night, promising to bring the doctor to see him first thing in the morning. But she knew, with a growing sense of unease, that the doctor would find nothing. The wound was gone, vanished, as if it had never been. She found herself glancing at him frequently, observing him from across the crowded ward. He lay quietly on his cot, his eyes closed, seemingly asleep. But there was a tension in his posture, a stillness that suggested he was not truly at rest. He was listening, she realized, to the sounds of the hospital, to the moans of the wounded, to the distant rumble of artillery. He was waiting. As the evening deepened, the activity in the ward began to subside. The exhausted nurses and orderlies moved with a slower, more deliberate pace. The air grew cooler, and the flickering lamplight cast long, dancing shadows on the canvas walls. Evelyn found herself sitting on a small stool near Captain Calloway's cot, ostensibly checking his pulse, but in reality, simply watching him. He opened his eyes, sensing her presence. "You're still here, Nurse Carter," he said, his voice soft in the quiet of the ward. "I am," she replied, meeting his gaze. "I told you I would bring the doctor in the morning." He smiled faintly. "I remember. But I also know that you don't believe me. You saw something that disturbed you." Evelyn hesitated. She was a nurse, trained in science and reason. She shouldn't be indulging in fantasies. But she couldn't deny what she had seen. "I saw a wound that shouldn't have been possible," she admitted, her voice low. And then it was gone. He was silent for a moment, his gaze searching hers. "There are things in this world, Nurse Carter, that defy explanation. Things that science cannot account for." "Are you going to tell me what those things are, Captain?" she asked, a challenge in her voice. He sighed, a sound of weariness that seemed to echo the weight of centuries. "I wish I could. But some things are better left unsaid. Some secrets are too dangerous to share." "Dangerous?" Evelyn repeated, a shiver running down her spine. "Dangerous to whom?" He looked away, his gaze fixed on the flickering lamplight. "To everyone." The silence stretched between them, filled only with the soft sounds of the sleeping soldiers and the distant, ever-present rumble of war. Evelyn felt a strange mixture of fear and fascination. She was drawn to this man, to the mystery that surrounded him, even as a part of her warned her to stay away. "Who are you, Captain Calloway?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a sadness that seemed to pierce her soul. "I am a soldier, just like the others, fighting for my country, trying to survive." It was a lie. She knew it, but she also knew that he wouldn't tell her the truth. Not yet. Another nurse, a young woman named Marie, approached them. "Evelyn," she said, her voice hushed, "Dr. Dubois wants to see you in his office." Evelyn nodded, reluctantly rising from her stool. She glanced at Captain Calloway, a silent question in her eyes. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod.
"Go," he said.
"I'll be here." As Evelyn followed Marie out of the ward, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was leaving something important behind. Something unfinished. She glanced back, just before she reached the entrance, and saw Captain Calloway watching her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. The whispers had already begun. Evelyn heard them as she walked through the hospital corridors, hushed conversations, glances in her direction. The other nurses, the orderlies, even some of the patients, were talking about the strange captain who didn't bleed, the impossible wound, the miraculous healing. The rumors were spreading like wildfire, fueled by fear and speculation. And Evelyn knew that she was at the center of it all. She was the one who had seen it, the one who had touched him, the one who knew something. The candle on Dr. Dubois' desk flickered, threatening to go out and plunge his small office into complete darkness. Chapter 3.
The Scars of Amiens.
Dr. Dubois' office was a small, cluttered space, smelling faintly of pipe tobacco and old books. He was a man in his late 50s, with thinning gray hair and tired, kindly eyes. He had seen more than his share of suffering during the war, and the lines on his face were etched deep with the burden of it all. He gestured for Evelyn to sit in the worn armchair opposite his desk. "Nurse Carter," he began, his voice weary, "I've been hearing reports about a Captain Calloway." Evelyn felt a knot of apprehension tighten in her stomach. "Yes, doctor? They say he had a serious wound. A shrapnel injury, I believe. But that it healed remarkably quickly." He paused, watching her closely. Evelyn knew she couldn't lie. Not to Dr. Dubois. He deserved the truth, even if she didn't fully understand it herself. "It's true, doctor," she said, her voice steady. "I saw it myself. The wound was deep. It should have been bleeding profusely. But it wasn't. And then it was gone, as if it had never been there." Dr. Dubois leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the walls of his office. "I've seen many strange things in this war, Nurse Carter," he said finally, his voice low. "Things that defy explanation. Men who should have died, living. Men who should have lived, dead. War, it does strange things to the human body.
To the human mind.
But this was different," Dr. Evelyn insisted. "This wasn't just adrenaline or a shock. This was something else." Dubois sighed. "I believe you, Nurse Carter. I trust your judgment. You're one of the best nurses I have. But we must be careful. Rumors, they can spread quickly in a place like this. They can cause panic.
Fear."
"I understand, Dr. Evelyn said. But what do we do? What do we tell people?" "We tell them the truth," Dubois said, his gaze meeting hers. "As much of the truth as we can. We say that Captain Calloway is a special case, that he is under observation, that we are doing everything we can to understand his condition." "And what about Captain Calloway himself?" Evelyn asked. "What does he say?" "He says very little," Dubois replied, a flicker of unease in his eyes. "He claims he is fine, that he wants to return to his unit. But there is something he is not telling us. Something he is hiding." Evelyn nodded, her own suspicions confirmed. "I know, doctor. I feel it too. We must be vigilant, Nurse Carter," Dubois said, his voice firm. "We must observe him closely.
And we must be prepared.
For anything." He stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. Evelyn rose as well, feeling a renewed sense of determination.
She would do as Dr. Dubois asked.
She would watch Captain Calloway. She would try to uncover his secret. But she would also be careful, because she knew, deep down, that this was more than just a medical mystery. This was something bigger, something dangerous. As she left the doctor's office and made her way back to the ward, Evelyn's mind drifted back to a conversation she'd had with her grandmother, a woman who had lived through many hardships and possessed a wisdom that transcended formal education. Her grandmother had spoken of old stories, of legends whispered in hushed tones, of beings that walked among humans, different, touched by something otherworldly. Evelyn had always dismissed those stories as folklore, as the imaginings of a simpler time. But now, standing in the dimly lit corridor of a war hospital, surrounded by the sounds of suffering and death, those old stories took on a new, unsettling resonance. She remembered a particular story, one her grandmother had told her when she was a child. A story about a soldier, a hero, who had fought in a long-ago war. He had been wounded, mortally so, but he had not died. He had lived on, seemingly immune to injury, to age. He had become a legend, a whisper in the annals of history. The scars of Amiens, the story called him, because it was in that city, during that ancient battle, that he had received his impossible wound. The wound that had changed him forever. Evelyn stopped, her breath catching in her throat.
Amiens.
It was not far from here, just a few miles to the north. The site of some of the fiercest fighting of the current war. Could it be? Could Captain Calloway be connected to that old story? The thought was absurd, impossible. And yet she couldn't shake it. The pieces were starting to fit together, forming a picture that was both terrifying and strangely compelling. She had to know more. The distant rumble of artillery intensified, a reminder of the relentless, brutal reality of the war. And in the heart of that reality, a mystery was unfolding. A mystery that Evelyn Carter was determined to solve. Chapter 4. A Dance with Shadows. Back in the ward, a fragile calm had settled. The wounded slept fitfully, their dreams haunted by the horrors they had witnessed. Evelyn moved quietly among them, checking bandages, administering medication, offering a comforting word or a gentle touch. She found Captain Calloway awake, his eyes fixed on the canvas ceiling, his expression distant and unreadable. "The doctor spoke with me," she said softly, sitting on the stool beside his cot. He turned his head, his gaze meeting hers. "And? He believes me," Evelyn said. "About your wound." Calloway said nothing, but a flicker of something relief crossed his face. "He wants me to observe you," she continued, "to monitor your condition." "I understand," he said, his voice low. "It's only natural. I am an anomaly." Evelyn hesitated. She wanted to ask him about Amiens, about the old stories, but she knew she had to tread carefully. He was still a stranger, a mystery, and she was beginning to suspect that he was also dangerous. "Have you always been like this?" she asked, choosing her words carefully. He looked away, his gaze drifting towards the entrance of the tent, as if he were listening to something beyond the walls of the hospital. "No," he said finally. "Not always." "What happened?" She pressed gently. "How did you become this way?" He was silent for a long moment, his expression troubled. "It's a long story, Nurse Carter," he said finally. "And not a pleasant one." "I have time," she said, meeting his gaze. "And I want to understand." He studied her for a moment, his eyes searching hers, as if he were trying to assess her sincerity. "Very well," he said finally. "But not here. Not now. There are too many ears. Too many eyes." "Where then?" she asked.
"There's an old church," he said.
"Just outside the village. It's mostly deserted. We can talk there. Tomorrow night. After dark." Evelyn felt a shiver of apprehension. Meeting him alone, in a deserted church, was risky. But she also knew that she couldn't resist. She had to know the truth. "I'll be there," she said. He nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "I know you will." The rest of the day passed slowly. Evelyn went through the motions of her duties, but her mind was preoccupied with the upcoming meeting. She found herself stealing glances at Captain Calloway, trying to decipher the secrets hidden behind his enigmatic gaze. He seemed to sense her scrutiny, and he would often meet her eyes, a silent communication passing between them. A dance with shadows, she thought. A dance of secrets and unspoken truths. As darkness fell, Evelyn made her excuses, telling the other nurses that she was going for a walk to clear her head. She slipped out of the hospital unnoticed, her heart pounding in her chest. The night air was cool and damp, and the sky was overcast, the moon hidden behind a thick layer of clouds. The village was quiet, most of the inhabitants having retreated to their homes, seeking shelter from the ever-present threat of war. Evelyn found the church easily. It was a small, stone structure, its roof partially collapsed, its windows shattered. It stood in a small, overgrown graveyard, the tombstones leaning at precarious angles, their inscriptions weathered and illegible. A sense of unease settled over her as she approached the church. It felt desolate, abandoned, haunted. She pushed open the heavy wooden door, which creaked ominously on its hinges. The interior of the church was dark and silent, the only light filtering through the broken windows and the gaps in the roof. The air was cold and damp, and the scent of dust and decay hung heavy in the air. "Captain Calloway?" She called out softly, her voice echoing in the silence. He emerged from the shadows, his figure tall and imposing in the darkness. "You came," he said, his voice low. "I said I would," she replied, her voice steadier than she felt. He gestured towards a broken pew near the front of the church. "Let's sit," he said. Evelyn followed him, her footsteps echoing on the stone floor. They sat in silence for a moment, the darkness pressing in around them. Evelyn could feel the weight of his gaze upon her, and she shivered, despite herself. The silence felt heavy, centuries old. She could almost feel the presence of all who had been in this church, all the prayers and pleas and vows made. Chapter 5. The Clockmaker's Secret. "You asked me how I became this way," Calloway began, his voice a low rumble in the stillness of the ruined church. He didn't look at her, instead staring straight ahead at the remnants of the altar, where a shattered crucifix lay amidst the rubble. "It's a story that spans centuries, Nurse Carter. A story of war, and loss, and a desperate bargain." Evelyn leaned forward, her attention riveted. "A bargain?" He nodded. "I was a soldier, much like the men you tend to hear. But this was long ago, during another war. A war that ravaged this very land, many lifetimes ago." He paused, his voice catching slightly. "The Siege of Amiens, 1597. I was a captain, leading a company of men against the Spanish. We were outnumbered, outgunned. We knew we were going to die." Evelyn remembered her grandmother's story. The scars of Amiens. Could this be the same man? The same battle? I was wounded," Calloway continued, his voice barely a whisper. "A musket ball to the chest. I felt the life draining out of me. I saw my men falling around me. I knew it was the end." He paused again, taking a deep breath, as if the memory itself were painful. But then something happened. "Someone found me." He was an old man, a clockmaker by trade. But he was also something more. He was an alchemist, a scholar of ancient secrets. Evelyn felt a chill run down her spine. An alchemist. This was sounding more and more like the stories her grandmother had told her. "He offered me a choice," Calloway said, his voice hardening. "He said he could save me. He could make me stronger, faster, immune to injury, immune to death, immortal." Evelyn breathed, the word escaping her lips before she could stop it. Calloway nodded slowly. "That's what he called it. But it was a curse, Nurse Carter. Not a blessing. A curse disguised as a gift." "What did he want in return?" Evelyn asked, her voice hushed. "He wanted knowledge," Calloway said. "He wanted to study me, to understand how it worked. He wanted to replicate it." He laughed, a short, bitter sound. He was obsessed with immortality. He believed it was the key to unlocking the secrets of the universe. "And you agreed?" Evelyn asked, incredulous. "I was dying," Calloway said, his voice sharp. "I had nothing to lose. And I wanted to live. To fight. To avenge my men." "So he changed you," Evelyn said, trying to grasp the enormity of what he was telling her. "He performed a ritual," Calloway said. "He used ancient texts, strange potions. He infused me with something that altered my very being." He finally turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a deep, unsettling sadness. "I woke up different. The wound was gone. I felt stronger, faster. But I also felt cold, empty. as if something essential had been taken from me. And the clockmaker? Evelyn asked. He kept me with him, Calloway said. For years. He studied me. He experimented on me. He tried to understand the mechanism of my immortality. But he never could. It was a fluke. A one-time occurrence. Something that could not be repeated. What happened to him? He died, Calloway said simply. Of old age. He achieved his immortality through me. But he could not achieve it for himself. And you've been alive ever since? Evelyn asked, struggling to comprehend the centuries that stretched between that long-ago battle and the present day. He nodded. I've seen countless wars. Countless battles. I've fought for many different countries. Under many different names. I've tried to use my gift for good. To protect the innocent. To fight for what I believe is right. But you're tired, Evelyn said, seeing the weariness in his eyes. He smiled, a sad, fleeting expression. Yes, Nurse Carter. I am tired. Tired of fighting. Tired of death. Tired of living. The weight of his words hung heavy in the air. Evelyn felt a profound sense of sorrow for this man, this immortal soldier, trapped in an endless cycle of war and loss. A floorboard creaked behind them. Both Evelyn and Calloway turned quickly. Chapter 6. Letters from a Ghost. Standing in the shadows near the entrance of the church was a young woman, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear. It was Marie, the other nurse from the hospital. She held a lantern in her trembling hand, its flickering light casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. Marie? Evelyn said, surprised and concerned. What are you doing here? Marie didn't answer. She just stared at Calloway, her gaze fixed on his face, her expression a mixture of terror and disbelief. I followed you, she stammered finally, her voice barely a whisper. I heard the whispers. About the captain. About his wound. Calloway stood up, his figure tall and imposing in the dim light. You shouldn't be here, he said, his voice low and warning. I had to see, Marie said, her voice trembling. I had to know if it was true. Evelyn stepped forward, placing a comforting hand on Marie's arm. It's all right, Marie, she said. It's complicated. But Captain Calloway is not dangerous. Marie shook her head, her eyes still fixed on Calloway. He's not human, she whispered. He's a monster. Calloway flinched, as if he had been struck. A flicker of pain crossed his face, and Evelyn felt a surge of sympathy for him. He's not a monster, Marie, Evelyn said firmly. He's a soldier. Just like the others. He's just different. Different? Marie repeated, her voice rising in hysteria. He's immortal. He doesn't bleed. He doesn't die. Marie, please, Evelyn said, trying to calm her down. You need to be quiet. You don't understand, but Marie wasn't listening. She was staring at Calloway, her eyes filled with a growing horror. I've seen him, she whispered. In my dreams. He's been haunting me. Ever since he arrived at the hospital. Calloway took a step back, his expression troubled. I don't know what you're talking about, he said. Liar. Marie cried. You do. You're him. The soldier from the stories. The one who can't die. Evelyn realized with a growing sense of dread that Marie knew more than she should. She had heard the same stories, the same legends that Evelyn had. And she had somehow connected them to Captain Calloway. Marie, you need to calm down, Evelyn said, her voice firm. You're letting your imagination run away with you.
No.
Marie insisted. I'm not imagining it. I've seen him. In the trenches. In the hospital.
He's always there.
Watching. Waiting. She turned to Evelyn, her eyes pleading. You have to believe me, Evelyn. He's dangerous. He's not what he seems. Evelyn was torn. She believed Calloway's story. She felt compassion for him. But she also saw the genuine fear in Marie's eyes. She couldn't dismiss her concerns entirely. Captain Calloway, Evelyn said, turning to him, is there anything you want to say to Marie? Anything that might explain her fears? Calloway hesitated. He looked at Marie, his expression unreadable. I don't know why she's having these dreams, he said finally. But I assure you, I mean her no harm. Liar. Marie cried again. You're a creature of darkness. A demon. You should be destroyed. She lunged forward, raising the lantern as if to strike him. Evelyn reacted instinctively, grabbing Marie's arm and pulling her back.
Marie, stop it.
Evelyn shouted. You're being irrational. Marie struggled against Evelyn's grip, her eyes wild with fear and rage. Let me go. He's evil. He needs to be stopped. The lantern slipped from Marie's grasp and fell to the floor, shattering on the stone. The flame flickered for a moment, then went out, plunging the church into darkness. Evelyn heard a gasp, a muffled cry, and then silence.
Marie?
Evelyn called out, her voice trembling. Marie, are you all right? There was no answer. Evelyn fumbled in her pocket for a match, her hands shaking. She struck it, the small flame illuminating the scene before her. Marie lay on the floor, unconscious, a small cut on her forehead. Calloway stood beside her, his expression grim. She fainted, he said, his voice low. She hit her head. Evelyn knelt beside Marie, checking her pulse. It was weak, but steady. She was breathing. We need to get her back to the hospital, Evelyn said, her voice urgent. Calloway nodded. He gently lifted Marie into his arms, her limp body surprisingly light. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else. Something that looked like regret. I'm sorry, he said. I didn't want this to happen. Evelyn didn't answer. She was too busy worrying about Marie and wondering what had really happened in those few moments of darkness. She followed Calloway out of the church, her mind racing. The whispers had turned into screams. The secret was out. And Evelyn knew that things were about to get much worse. As they walked into the hospital, Calloway quietly placed Marie on a nearby cot. As he did, a small, folded piece of paper fell from Marie's pocket. Chapter 7. Beneath the Poppy Fields. Evelyn quickly scooped up the fallen paper, her heart pounding. She recognized it instantly as a letter, its edges worn and creased from repeated handling. Marie must have been carrying it with her, a secret she had kept hidden. Evelyn glanced at Calloway, who was watching her with a wary expression. He knew, she realized, that the letter held something important. Something that could reveal more about Marie's fears, and perhaps about his own past. They managed to get Marie settled into a bed, the other nurses clucking over her, thankfully attributing her faint to exhaustion and the stress of the ward. Evelyn made excuses, promising to check on Marie later, and then she slipped away, the letter clutched tightly in her hand. She found a quiet corner in the supply room, the air thick with the scent of bandages and disinfectant. She unfolded the letter carefully, her hands trembling slightly. The handwriting was delicate, feminine, but the ink was faded, the paper yellowed with age. It was dated several years earlier and addressed to a dearest Marie from a woman named Annalise. Evelyn began to read, her heart pounding in her chest. My dearest Marie, I write to you with a heavy heart, filled with both sorrow and fear. I have discovered something terrible, something that I must share with you, even though it may put us both in danger. It concerns the man we both know, the man we both loved. The man who called himself Jean-Luc. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat.
Jean-Luc.
It was a French name, a common name, but something about the way it was written, the way it was emphasized, sent a shiver down her spine. He is not who he claims to be, Marie. He is different. He has secrets. Secrets that he has kept hidden from us for many years.
I have seen things.
Things that defy explanation. Things that terrify me.
He doesn't age, Marie.
He doesn't heal like normal men. I have seen wounds disappear, as if they were never there. And I have heard stories, whispers in the village, about a soldier who cannot die. I believe he is that soldier, Marie. The one from the legends. The one they call the Scars of Amiens. He is immortal. And he is dangerous. I fear for my life, Marie. I fear that he will discover that I know his secret. And I fear what he will do to me if he does. I am writing this letter to you as a warning. If anything should happen to me, you must be careful. You must stay away from him. He is not to be trusted. I love you, Marie. And I pray that you will be safe. Yours always, Annalise. Evelyn finished reading the letter, her hands shaking. The pieces were falling into place, forming a terrifying picture. Marie's fears were not just the product of an overactive imagination. They were based on something real. Something that had happened years ago. Something that involved a woman named Annalise and a man who called himself Jean-Luc. A man who was, in all likelihood, Captain James Calloway. Evelyn felt a surge of anger and betrayal. Calloway had lied to her. He had not told her the whole truth. He had omitted a crucial part of his story. A part that involved a woman who had loved him and who had feared him. A woman who had disappeared. She refolded the letter, her mind racing. She had to confront Calloway. She had to demand answers. But she also had to be careful. She knew that he was capable of anything. She slipped the letter into her pocket, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She left the supply room and made her way back to the ward. She found Calloway standing near Marie's bed, watching her sleep. He turned as she approached, his expression guarded.
How is she?
Evelyn asked, her voice cold.
She's resting, Calloway said. She'll be all right.
Did you know, Captain? Evelyn asked, her gaze unwavering. Did you know about Annalise? His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. Annalise? He repeated. Who is Annalise? Don't lie to me, Captain, Evelyn said, her voice trembling with anger. I found this letter. In Marie's pocket. She pulled the letter out of her pocket and held it out to him. He stared at it, his expression unreadable. Where did you get this? He asked, his voice low. It doesn't matter, Evelyn said. What matters is what it says. It says you killed her. You killed Annalise. Calloway shook his head, his eyes filled with a sudden, intense emotion.
No, he said.
That's not true. I loved Annalise. I would never have hurt her. Then what happened to her? Evelyn demanded. Where is she? Calloway was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the letter in Evelyn's hand. She left, he said finally. She couldn't handle it. My secret. She ran away. That's not what the letter says, Evelyn said, her voice shaking. The letter says she feared you. She feared for her life. The sound of approaching footsteps made them both jump. A contingent of military police strode towards them, led by a stern-faced officer. Chapter 8. The Promise of Dawn. The officer, a major with a steely gaze and a neatly trimmed mustache, stopped in front of Calloway, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. Captain James Calloway? He inquired, his voice sharp and authoritative. Calloway straightened, his expression hardening. Yes, Major? You are to come with us, the Major said, his tone leaving no room for argument. You are under arrest. Evelyn gasped, her hand flying to her mouth.
Arrest?
She exclaimed. On what charges? The Major ignored her, his gaze fixed on Calloway. Desertion, espionage, and suspicion of unnatural practices. Evelyn's heart sank. The whispers had reached the higher authorities, and they had come for Calloway. She knew that he was innocent of desertion and espionage, but the last charge, that was the one that terrified her. The one that could condemn him to a fate worse than death. These charges are absurd, Calloway said, his voice calm, but his eyes filled with a cold fury. I have done nothing wrong. That will be determined by a military tribunal, the Major said, his voice devoid of emotion. You will be held in custody until your trial. He gestured to the military police, who stepped forward, their hands resting on their weapons. Calloway didn't resist. He simply stood there, his expression unreadable, as they escorted him out of the ward. Evelyn watched them go, her heart aching with a mixture of fear and despair. She knew that Calloway was in grave danger. The military authorities would not understand his condition. They would see him as a threat, a monster, and they would dispose of him.
She had to do something.
She had to help him.
But she didn't know how.
She was just a nurse, a woman in a world dominated by men and war. What could she possibly do against the might of the military? She looked down at the letter in her hand, Annalise's letter. It was the only clue she had. The only link to Calloway's past. The only hope of proving his innocence, or at least of understanding the truth. She decided then and there that she would follow the trail of the letter. She would find out what had happened to Annalise. She would uncover the truth about Calloway's past. And she would save him, even if it meant risking her own life. She slipped the letter back into her pocket, her determination hardening. She would start by searching Marie's belongings, looking for any other clues that might shed light on Annalise's disappearance. She would also try to find out more about the unnatural practices that Calloway was accused of. She would talk to the other nurses, the orderlies, the patients. She would gather information, piece together the puzzle, and unravel the mystery. She knew it wouldn't be easy. She knew that she would face opposition, resistance, perhaps even danger. But she was not afraid. She was driven by a fierce sense of loyalty, of compassion, and of something more. Something that she couldn't quite name. Something that felt like love. As she made her way out of the ward, she saw Dr. Dubois standing in the corridor, his expression grave. He had witnessed the arrest, and he knew that Evelyn was involved. "Nurse Carter," he said softly, "be careful. This is a dangerous game you're playing." "I know, Doctor," Evelyn said, her voice steady. "But I have to do this. I have to help him." Dubois nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and admiration.
"I understand," he said.
"And I will help you. As much as I can." He gave her a small, encouraging smile. "There is a network," he said, his voice low, "of people who believe,
Who know about the others?
who offer assistance. I can put you in touch with them." Evelyn's heart leaped with hope. She wasn't alone. There were others who knew the truth, who could help her. "Thank you, Doctor," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "That would be invaluable." Dubois gave her a name and a location, a small village not far from the hospital. He told her to ask for a woman named Madame Sophie. He said that she would know what to do. Evelyn left the hospital that night, her heart filled with a renewed sense of hope. She knew that the road ahead would be long and difficult. But she was not alone. She had allies. And she had a promise to keep. A promise to Calloway. A promise to herself. A promise of dawn. The first rays of sunlight began to peek over the horizon, casting a faint glow on the poppy fields that surrounded the village. Evelyn looked at the flowers, their vibrant red petals a stark contrast to the muddy, war-torn landscape. She remembered a line from a poem she had read once, a poem about the poppies of Flanders fields. "If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep, though poppies grow, in Flanders fields." She thought of Calloway, of his long, lonely existence, his endless struggle. And she vowed that she would not break faith with him. The air smelled fresh and clean, a temporary reprieve from the usual stench of the hospital and the war. Chapter 9. Betrayal at the Front. Madame Sophie's house was a small, unassuming cottage on the outskirts of the village, its walls covered in ivy, its windows shuttered. Evelyn approached cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. She knocked on the door, a soft, hesitant rap. After a moment, the door creaked open, and an elderly woman with piercing blue eyes and a weathered face peered out at her. She wore a simple black dress, and her silver hair was pulled back in a tight bun. This was Madame Sophie. "Yes?" she inquired, her voice sharp, but not unkind. "Dr. Dubois sent me," Evelyn said, her voice trembling slightly. "He said you could help me." Madame Sophie studied her for a moment, her eyes searching hers, as if she were trying to assess her sincerity. Then, she nodded slowly and opened the door wider.
"Come in, child," she said.
"We have much to discuss." Evelyn stepped inside, the interior of the cottage surprisingly cozy and warm. A fire crackled in the hearth, and the air was filled with the scent of herbs and wood smoke. Madame Sophie gestured for her to sit in a worn armchair near the fire. "Dr. Dubois tells me you are involved with a man named Calloway," Madame Sophie said, her voice low, as she sat opposite Evelyn. "Yes," Evelyn replied. He's been arrested. He's accused of terrible things." "He is one of the others," Madame Sophie said, her gaze unwavering. "Is he not?" Evelyn nodded, her heart sinking. She had hoped that Madame Sophie might offer some explanation, some alternative to the truth she already knew. But it seemed that the old woman was well aware of Calloway's condition. "I know," Evelyn said. "He told me
his story."
"And you believe him?" Madame Sophie asked, her eyes piercing. "I do," Evelyn said firmly. "I know he's not a monster. He's a good man. He's just different." Madame Sophie smiled faintly.
"Good," she said.
"That is important. Because the others, they are not always good. Some of them have embraced the darkness. They have forgotten their humanity. Calloway hasn't," Evelyn said, her voice filled with conviction. He's suffered. He's lost so much. But he still cares. He still fights for what he believes is right. Then we must help him," Madame Sophie said, her voice firm. "We must prove his innocence. And we must protect him from those who would harm him." She explained to Evelyn that she was part of a network, a secret society, that had existed for centuries, dedicated to protecting the others, the immortals, from those who would exploit or destroy them. They provided sanctuary, information, and assistance to those who were in need. "The military authorities, they are not our friends," Madame Sophie said. "They see the others as weapons, as tools to be used. They do not understand them. They do not care about their humanity." "What can we do?" Evelyn asked, her voice urgent. "How can we help Calloway?" "We must find evidence," Madame Sophie said. "Evidence that will exonerate him. Evidence that will prove his true nature." She told Evelyn that she had heard rumors of Calloway's arrest and that she had already begun to investigate. She had learned that the charges against him were based on the testimony of a single witness, a soldier who had served under Calloway's command. "This soldier, he claims that Calloway deserted his post," Madame Sophie said. "That he betrayed his comrades. That he collaborated with the enemy." "That's a lie," Evelyn exclaimed. "Calloway would never do that. He's a hero." "Perhaps," Madame Sophie said, her voice cautious. "But we must have proof. We must find out what really happened at the front." She suggested that Evelyn travel to the area where Calloway had been stationed, a small village near the front lines, and talk to the soldiers who had served with him. She might be able to find someone who could corroborate Calloway's story, or who could discredit the testimony of the accusing witness. "It will be dangerous," Madame Sophie warned. "The front lines are a chaotic place, and there are those who would not want you to succeed." "I don't care," Evelyn said, her voice firm. "I'm not afraid. I'll do whatever it takes to help Calloway." Madame Sophie nodded, her eyes filled with admiration.
"Good," she said.
"Then you must leave immediately. Time is of the essence." She provided Evelyn with a map, a forged pass, and a contact in the village, a local farmer who was sympathetic to their cause. She also gave her a small, silver amulet, shaped like a crescent moon. "This will protect you," Madame Sophie said. "It will ward off evil. And it will help you to find your way." Evelyn took the amulet, her fingers closing around it tightly. She felt a surge of hope, of determination. She was not alone. She had allies. And she had a mission. As Evelyn left the cottage, a raven landed on a nearby tree, its black eyes watching her intently. It cawed loudly, the sound echoing in the stillness of the early morning. A warning or a blessing? Evelyn couldn't tell, but she knew that her journey had begun. She checked the crumpled map again, noting the location of the farmer's house and the name written beside it.
Pierre Dubois.
A relative of the doctor? Chapter 10. The Stolen Map. The journey to the front lines was arduous and perilous. Evelyn traveled by train, by truck, and finally on foot, her forged pass allowing her to navigate the numerous checkpoints and military patrols. The landscape became increasingly bleak, the fields scarred by trenches, the trees shattered by artillery fire. The air was thick with a stench of smoke, cordite, and decay. She reached the village, a cluster of ruined buildings and makeshift shelters, late in the afternoon. The sounds of war were close now, the constant rumble of artillery, the occasional crackle of gunfire. The village was teeming with soldiers, their faces grim and weary, their uniforms caked with mud. Evelyn found the farmer's house, a small, stone structure that had somehow survived the shelling relatively intact. She knocked on the door, her heart pounding in her chest. A man in his late 40s, with a weathered face and kind eyes, opened the door. He looked at her suspiciously, his hand resting on the rifle slung over his shoulder. This was Pierre Dubois, Dr. Dubois' cousin. Yes, he inquired, his voice gruff. Madame Sophie sent me, Evelyn said, her voice trembling slightly. I need your help. Pierre studied her for a moment, his eyes narrowed. Then he nodded slowly and opened the door wider.
Come in, he said. Quickly.
Evelyn stepped inside, the interior of the house dark and sparsely furnished. Pierre closed and bolted the door, then lit a single candle, its flickering light casting long shadows on the walls. You are the nurse, he said, his voice low. The one who was involved with the captain. Yes, Evelyn replied. I need to find out what happened. At the front. I need to prove his innocence. Pierre nodded, his expression grim. It will not be easy, he said. The soldier who accused him, he is a powerful man. He has friends. In high places. He explained that the accusing witness was a lieutenant named Dubois, no relation, thankfully a cruel and ambitious officer who had a reputation for brutality and ruthlessness. He had been Calloway's second in command, and there had been bad blood between them. They clashed repeatedly, Pierre said. Over strategy. Over tactics. Over the treatment of the men. Calloway, he cared about his soldiers. Dubois, he cared only about himself. What happened? Evelyn asked, her voice urgent. What led to the accusation?
Pierre hesitated.
There was a battle, he said finally. A fierce engagement. Near the river. The Germans, they launched a surprise attack. We were outnumbered. Outgunned. He described a chaotic and brutal scene, a desperate struggle for survival. Calloway had led his men bravely, fighting with a ferocity that had inspired them all. But Dubois, he had panicked. He had ordered a retreat. A premature and disastrous retreat. Calloway, he refused, Pierre said. He knew that if they retreated, they would be slaughtered. He ordered his men to hold their ground, to fight to the last. The battle had raged for hours, the outcome uncertain. But Calloway's courage and determination had turned the tide. The Germans had been repulsed, their attack thwarted. But the victory had come at a great cost. Many men had been killed. Many more wounded. And Dubois? Evelyn asked. He survived, Pierre said, his voice filled with disgust. He hid. He let others die. And then he blamed Calloway. He claimed that Calloway had disobeyed orders, that he had endangered the lives of his men, that he had caused the heavy casualties. That's a lie, Evelyn exclaimed. He's trying to cover up his own cowardice. I know, Pierre said. But he has evidence. He has witnesses. He has a map.
A map?
Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. What map? A military map, Pierre explained, showing the positions of the troops, the lines of attack, the objectives. Dubois claims that Calloway stole the map, that he gave it to the enemy, that he planned the German attack. Evelyn felt a surge of despair. A stolen map. That was damning evidence. Even she, with all her belief in Calloway, couldn't easily dismiss that. Where is the map now? She asked, her voice trembling. Dubois has it, Pierre said. He keeps it locked away. In his quarters. He plans to present it at the trial. Evelyn knew what she had to do. She had to get that map. She had to see it for herself. She had to find out if it was genuine, if it was proof of Calloway's guilt, or if it was a forgery. I need to get into Dubois' quarters, she said, her voice firm. I need to see that map. Pierre looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and admiration. It is too dangerous, he said. Dubois is always guarded. He is paranoid. He trusts no one. I have to try, Evelyn said. It's the only way to help Calloway. Pierre hesitated, then nodded slowly. Very well, he said. I will help you. But we must be careful. One mistake, and we are dead. He explained that Dubois' quarters were located in a fortified farmhouse on the edge of the village, heavily guarded by soldiers loyal to him. He had a plan, a risky and audacious plan, to get Evelyn inside. But it would require stealth, courage, and a bit of luck. As they began to finalize the details of their plan, a sudden, sharp knock on the door made them both jump. Pierre grabbed his rifle, his eyes filled with alarm. He motioned for Evelyn to hide behind a stack of crates in the corner. Chapter 11. Echoes of a Lost Love. Pierre cautiously approached the door, his rifle held ready. He peered through a small crack, his body tense. Then, he relaxed slightly and unbolted the door, opening it a fraction. "Lieutenant Dubois," he said, his voice surprisingly calm. "What brings you here?" Evelyn, hidden behind the crates, held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear Dubois' voice, cold and arrogant, as he spoke. "I'm looking for someone," Dubois said. "A nurse. From the hospital. She's been asking questions. About Captain Calloway." Evelyn's blood ran cold. Dubois was looking for her. He knew she was here. "I haven't seen any nurse," Pierre said, his voice steady. "This is a quiet village. We don't get many visitors." "She's here," Dubois insisted. "I have informants. They saw her entering this house." "You must be mistaken," Pierre said. "I live alone. I'm just a simple farmer." Dubois pushed the door open wider, forcing his way inside. He glanced around the room, his eyes narrowed with suspicion. Evelyn remained hidden, her body pressed against the cold stone wall, her breath held tight in her chest. "I don't believe you," Dubois said, his voice menacing. "I think you're hiding her. And if you are, you'll regret it." He stepped further into the room, his gaze sweeping across the sparse furnishings. Evelyn knew that it was only a matter of time before he found her. Pierre stood his ground, his body blocking Dubois' path. "I have nothing to hide," he said. "You are welcome to search my house. But you will find nothing." Dubois hesitated, his eyes flickering between Pierre and the rest of the room. Then he seemed to make a decision. He turned to the two soldiers who had accompanied him, their faces impassive, their rifles held ready. "Search the house," he ordered. "Find her, and bring her to me." The soldiers began to move, their boots heavy on the wooden floor. Evelyn knew that she had to act fast. She couldn't let them find her. She couldn't let them take her to Dubois. She looked around desperately, searching for an escape route. There was a small window at the back of the room, partially hidden by a tattered curtain. It was her only chance. As the soldiers approached the crates, Evelyn made her move. She burst out from her hiding place, pushing past the startled soldiers and running towards the window. She threw open the shutters, the glass shattering on the ground outside, and scrambled through the opening, her heart pounding in her chest. "Stop her!" Dubois shouted, his voice filled with rage. "Don't let her escape." Evelyn ran, her feet pounding on the muddy ground, her lungs burning. She could hear the soldiers pursuing her, their shouts echoing in the night. She didn't dare look back. She just ran, as fast as she could, towards the darkness of the nearby woods. She stumbled, falling to her knees, her hands scraping on the rough ground. She scrambled back to her feet, ignoring the pain, and continued to run, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She could hear the soldiers gaining on her, their footsteps closer now. She knew that she couldn't outrun them. She needed to hide. She spotted a large, hollow tree, its trunk gnarled and twisted with age. She scrambled inside, squeezing herself into the narrow space, her body trembling with fear and exhaustion. The soldiers ran past, their shouts fading into the distance. Evelyn remained hidden, her heart pounding in her chest, her breath held tight in her lungs. She waited, listening, for what seemed like an eternity. Finally, when she was sure that the soldiers were gone, she emerged from the tree, her body stiff and aching. She was alone, in the darkness of the woods, her heart filled with a mixture of fear and relief. She had escaped Dubois, but she was still lost. She didn't know where she was. She didn't know how to get back to the village. She didn't know how to continue her mission. She looked around, trying to get her bearings. The moon was hidden behind a thick layer of clouds, casting the woods in a deep, impenetrable darkness. The air was cold and damp, and the silence was broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant rumble of artillery. She felt a sudden wave of despair, of hopelessness. She was alone, vulnerable and lost. She felt like giving up, like surrendering. But then, she remembered Calloway. She remembered his story. his suffering, his courage. She remembered the look in his eyes, the sadness, the weariness, but also the strength. She remembered Annalise, the letter, the fear, the disappearance. She remembered her promise to find the truth, to help him. She straightened her shoulders, her determination renewed. She would not give up. She would not surrender. She would find a way. She began to walk, her steps slow and hesitant at first, then gaining confidence. She didn't know where she was going, but she knew that she had to keep moving. She had to find her way back. To the village. To the map. To Callaway. As she walked, she noticed something glinting on the ground, a small, metallic object, partially hidden beneath a pile of leaves. She knelt down and picked it up, her heart skipping a beat. It was a locket, a silver locket shaped like a heart. She opened it carefully, her fingers trembling. Inside, there were 2 miniature portraits, faded with age. One was of a young man, with dark hair and intense eyes. The other was of a woman, a beautiful woman, with long, flowing hair and a gentle smile. Evelyn recognized the man instantly. It was Callaway. A younger version of Callaway, but undeniably him. And the woman, she recognized her too. From the letter. From Marie's description. It was Annalise. Evelyn clutched the locket tightly in her hand, her heart filled with a sudden, overwhelming emotion. It was a connection. A link to Callaway's past. A reminder of his lost love. A memento Annalise must have dropped running away. The sound of distant singing, a haunting melody carried on the wind, broke the silence. Chapter 12. The Midnight Escape. The singing, a woman's voice, clear and sweet, yet tinged with a profound sadness, drew Evelyn towards it. It seemed to be coming from a small clearing just beyond a thicket of trees. She cautiously approached, her heart pounding in her chest, the locket clutched tightly in her hand. As she emerged into the clearing, she saw a sight that made her stop in her tracks. A group of women, perhaps a dozen or so, were gathered around a small fire, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. They were dressed in simple, homespun clothes, their heads covered with scarves. They were singing a mournful ballad, a lament for lost loves and broken dreams. Evelyn recognized the song. It was an old folk tune, a story of a young woman who had been betrayed by her lover, a soldier who had gone off to war and never returned. It was a song that resonated with the pain and suffering of countless women throughout the centuries. As the song ended, one of the women, an older woman with a kind face and gentle eyes, noticed Evelyn standing at the edge of the clearing. She beckoned her forward, her expression welcoming. "Come, child," she said, her voice soft. "Join us. You are welcome here." Evelyn hesitated, then stepped into the clearing, her heart filled with a strange mixture of fear and gratitude. She sat down beside the older woman, the warmth of the fire a welcome relief from the cold night air.
"Who are you?"
the woman asked, her eyes searching Evelyn's face. "My name is Evelyn," she replied, her voice trembling slightly.
"Y I'm a nurse."
From the hospital. The woman nodded, her expression understanding.
"And you were lost," she said.
"Yes," Evelyn admitted. I was being chased. By soldiers." The woman smiled sadly. "Soldiers," she repeated. "They are always chasing someone. Always causing pain." She introduced herself as Marguerite, and she explained that the women were all from the local villages, wives, mothers, sisters, daughters, of soldiers who had gone off to war. They gathered in the clearing every night to sing, to pray, and to offer comfort to each other. "We have all lost someone," Marguerite said. "We have all suffered, but we find strength in each other, in our shared sorrow." Evelyn felt a sense of belonging, of kinship with these women. She understood their pain. She shared their grief. She too had lost someone,
or was about to.
She showed Marguerite the locket, explaining how she had found it. Marguerite examined it carefully, her eyes widening slightly. This belonged to Annalise," she said, her voice hushed. "She was one of us. She used to come here, to sing with us." "You knew her?" Evelyn asked, her heart pounding. Yes, Marguerite replied. She was a dear friend, a beautiful soul. She loved a soldier, a man named Jean-Luc Calloway, Evelyn said, her voice barely a whisper. Marguerite nodded. He was different, she said. He was charming. He was passionate. But he was also secretive. He had a darkness that Annalise could not see. What happened to her? Evelyn asked, her voice urgent. Where did she go? Marguerite hesitated. She disappeared, she said finally. One night. She just vanished. Without a trace. Did Calloway kill her? Evelyn asked, her heart sinking. Marguerite shook her head.
I don't know, she said.
I don't want to believe it. But there were rumors. Whispers. That he had done something to her. That he had taken her away. But there's no proof, Evelyn said, her voice pleading. No, Marguerite agreed.
No proof.
Only suspicion. Only fear. She told Evelyn that Annalise had been terrified of Calloway in the days before her disappearance. She had confided in Marguerite, telling her about his strange behavior, his unnatural healing, his secretive past. She had discovered something, Marguerite said. Something that frightened her. She had found a letter from his past. A letter that revealed his true nature. Evelyn gasped. It couldn't be the same letter, could it? A map? Evelyn asked.
Yes.
Hidden inside a book, Marguerite responded. A map and documents. Evelyn felt a surge of hope. The map. It was the key. The key to proving Calloway's innocence. Or his guilt. But where was the book now? Do you have it now? Evelyn questioned, barely able to contain her excitement. Marguerite sadly shook her head. Annalise showed it to me once. Right here in these woods. But she was too scared to keep it with her. She hid the book and the map, not far from here, before she vanished. Can you show me where? Marguerite nodded. Follow me. The women left the clearing, their footsteps silent on the soft earth. They walked for several minutes, deeper into the woods, until they reached a small, secluded grove. Marguerite pointed to a large, ancient oak tree, its branches gnarled and twisted. She hid it there, she said, beneath the roots. Evelyn knelt down and began to dig, her hands trembling with anticipation. The earth was soft and damp, and she quickly uncovered a small, wooden box, its surface covered in moss and lichen. She lifted the box carefully, her heart pounding in her chest. She opened it, her fingers trembling. Inside, nestled among a bed of dried leaves, was a book. And, inside the book, a folded map. Evelyn knew that she had found what she was looking for. The truth. The evidence. The key to Calloway's fate. A sudden, sharp whistle pierced the silence, followed by the sound of approaching footsteps. Soldiers. They had been followed. Chapter 13. Sanctuary in Ruins. Marguerite grabbed Evelyn's arm, her eyes wide with alarm.
Run,
she whispered. They must not find you. They must not find the book. Evelyn didn't hesitate. She clutched the book and the map to her chest and ran, her feet pounding on the soft earth, her lungs burning. Marguerite and the other women scattered, disappearing into the darkness of the woods. Evelyn ran blindly, her only thought to escape, to protect the evidence she now held. She could hear the soldiers behind her, their shouts echoing through the trees, their footsteps gaining on her. She stumbled, falling to her knees, the book slipping from her grasp. She scrambled to retrieve it, her fingers brushing against the rough bark of the oak tree. She looked up, her eyes widening in surprise. She had stumbled upon a ruin, a crumbling stone structure, hidden amidst the trees. It looked like an old chapel, its walls partially collapsed, its roof long gone. It was overgrown with ivy and moss, its windows shattered, its door hanging precariously on its hinges. It was a sanctuary, a hiding place. She scrambled to her feet and ran towards a ruin, pushing open the heavy wooden door and slipping inside. The interior was dark and silent, the air cold and damp. The only light filtered through the broken windows and the gaps in the walls, casting long, eerie shadows on the stone floor. Evelyn leaned against the door, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her heart pounding in her chest. She listened, her ears straining for any sound of pursuit. She could hear the soldiers outside, their voices closer now. They were searching for her, calling out her name. She knew that it was only a matter of time before they found the ruin. Before they found her. She looked around desperately, searching for a place to hide. There were no rooms, no alcoves, no secret passages. Just the crumbling walls, the shattered windows, and the stone floor. She spotted a large, stone altar at the far end of the chapel, its surface covered in dust and debris. It was the only possible hiding place. She ran towards the altar, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She knelt down behind it, squeezing herself into the narrow space between the altar and the wall. She pulled the book and the map close to her chest, her body trembling with fear. She heard the soldiers enter the ruin, their boots heavy on the stone floor. Their voices were loud and harsh, their language brutal. They were searching for her, their movements methodical and thorough. "She's here somewhere," one of them said. "I saw her, running towards this ruin." "Find her," another voice commanded. "And bring her to me, alive." Evelyn held her breath, her heart pounding in her chest, her body pressed against the cold stone wall. She closed her eyes, praying that they wouldn't find her, praying that they wouldn't take her. The soldiers searched the ruin, their footsteps echoing around her. They overturned benches, peered into corners, their movements growing increasingly frantic. Evelyn could hear them getting closer, their voices just a few feet away. She squeezed her eyes tighter, her body trembling uncontrollably. She knew that it was over, that they had found her. But then, a strange thing happened. The soldiers stopped. Their voices faded. Their footsteps receded. Evelyn opened her eyes, her heart still pounding, her breath catching in her throat. She listened, her ears straining for any sound. Silence. She waited, her body tense, her muscles aching. She waited for what seemed like an eternity. Finally, when she was sure that the soldiers were gone, she slowly emerged from her hiding place, her legs stiff and cramped. She looked around, her eyes wide with disbelief. The ruin was empty. The soldiers were gone. She had been spared.
She had been saved. But how? Why?
She walked towards the entrance of the chapel, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She peered outside, cautiously, her eyes scanning the surrounding woods. There was no one there. The soldiers had vanished, as if they had never been there. Evelyn felt a strange sense of unease, of bewilderment. Something unnatural had happened, something that she couldn't explain. She looked down at the book and the map in her hands, her heart filled with a renewed sense of determination. She had escaped. She had survived. And she still had the evidence. She knew that she had to get out of the woods. She had to get back to the village. She had to find a way to help Calloway. But as she stepped out of the ruin, she realized that she was not alone. Standing in the shadows, just beyond the entrance of the chapel, was a figure. Tall, dark, and familiar. It was Captain Calloway. He stood silently, regarding Evelyn with those unsettling eyes. But how? Chapter 14. The Alchemist's Journal. Evelyn stared at Calloway, her mind reeling. He was supposed to be in prison under arrest awaiting trial. How had he escaped? How had he found her? Calloway? She whispered, her voice trembling. How did you? He stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "It doesn't matter," he said, his voice low. "What matters is that you're safe. And that you have the book." He reached out his hand, his gaze fixed on the book Evelyn clutched to her chest. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. Could she trust him? After everything that had happened? After Annalise's disappearance? But then, she looked into his eyes, and she saw something there that reassured her. A sadness, a weariness, but also a sincerity. A desperation. She slowly handed him the book, her fingers brushing against his. He took it, his gaze never leaving hers. "Thank you," he said, his voice barely a whisper. He opened the book carefully, his fingers tracing the faded, handwritten text. It was an old book, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. It was written in a mixture of Latin and Old French, a language that Evelyn could barely understand. "What is it?" she asked, her voice curious. "It's the Alchemist's Journal," Calloway replied. "The journal of the man who changed me. The man who made me this way." He explained that the journal contained the alchemist's notes, his experiments, his research into immortality. It was a record of his obsession, his madness, and his ultimate failure. "He never found the secret," Calloway said. "He never managed to replicate it. I was a fluke. An accident. A one-time occurrence." He turned to the back of the book, where the map was tucked inside. He unfolded it carefully, his fingers tracing the faded lines and markings. "This is what Du Bois wants," he said. "This is what he plans to use against me." Evelyn looked at the map, her heart sinking. It was a detailed military map, showing the positions of the troops, the lines of attack, the objectives.
And it was marked.
Marked with annotations, in Calloway's handwriting. "It looks bad," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "It looks like you did plan the attack." Calloway shook his head.
"It's a forgery," he said.
Du Bois, he altered the map. He added my handwriting. He fabricated the evidence. "But how can you prove that?" Evelyn asked, her voice desperate. Calloway pointed to a small, almost imperceptible detail on the map, a tiny symbol hidden among the other markings. "This," he said. "This is the key. This is the proof of my innocence." He explained that the symbol was a secret code, a marker that he had used in all his official communications. It was a way of authenticating his documents, of protecting them from forgery. "Du Bois, he doesn't know about this," Calloway said. "He copied my handwriting. But he missed the symbol. He didn't know it was there." The symbol on the map, however, was slightly different from the one Calloway described. It was incomplete, as if someone had tried to copy it but had failed. "This map, it's not mine," Calloway said, his voice firm. "It's a fake. A clever fake. But a fake nonetheless." Evelyn felt a surge of relief, of hope. Calloway was innocent. He had not betrayed his men. He had not collaborated with the enemy. "We need to get this to the authorities," she said, her voice urgent. "We need to show them the truth." "It won't be easy," Calloway said. "Du Bois has friends. In high places. They will try to stop us." He explained that he had escaped from prison with the help of the network. Madame Sophie and her allies had arranged his escape, providing him with a disguise, a safe passage, and information. "They told me about you," Calloway said. "They told me about your bravery, your determination, your loyalty." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a warmth that made her heart flutter. "You risked your life for me," he said. "You believed in me, even when everyone else doubted me." Evelyn blushed, her cheeks flushing with a mixture of embarrassment and pleasure. I just did what I thought was right," she said. "You did more than that," Calloway said. "You saved me. You gave me hope." He reached out and took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. Evelyn felt a jolt of electricity pass through her body, her heart beating faster. "We need to get to Paris," Calloway said. "To the headquarters of the network. They can help us. They can expose Du Bois. They can clear my name." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a question. "Will you come with me?" he asked. Evelyn didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said, her voice firm. "I will." Calloway carefully placed the journal and map into his satchel and turned back to Evelyn. "We have a long way to go." Chapter 15. Shattered Reflections. The journey to Paris was fraught with danger. Calloway and Evelyn traveled by night, avoiding the main roads, hiding in barns and abandoned buildings, relying on the kindness of strangers and the assistance of the network. They were constantly on the lookout for soldiers, for patrols, for anyone who might recognize them. Calloway was a changed man. The weight of his false imprisonment, the betrayal by Du Bois, and the ever-present threat to his existence had taken their toll. He was more withdrawn, more cautious, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon, his hand never far from the knife he carried hidden beneath his coat. Evelyn watched him, her heart aching for him. She saw the pain he carried, the burden of his long life, the endless cycle of war and loss. She wanted to comfort him, to ease his suffering, but she knew that she couldn't. She could only offer him her support, her loyalty, and her love. For she had realized, during those long, perilous nights, that she had fallen in love with him. With the immortal soldier, the man who had lived for centuries, the man who had seen so much death and destruction, yet still retained a spark of humanity, a capacity for kindness, and a longing for peace. She knew that it was a foolish, impossible love. He was immortal, she was mortal. He was from another time, another world. He could never belong to her. And yet, she couldn't help herself. She loved him, with all her heart, with all her soul. One evening, as they were sheltering in a deserted farmhouse, Evelyn found Calloway staring into a cracked and dusty mirror, his expression troubled. He was tracing the lines on his face, the scars that marked his long and tumultuous life. "What do you see?" Evelyn asked softly, approaching him from behind. He turned, his eyes meeting hers in the reflection. "I see a ghost," he said, his voice low. "A shadow. A man who shouldn't exist." Evelyn stepped closer, placing her hand on his arm. "You're not a ghost," she said. "You're real. You're alive." "Am I?" he asked, his voice filled with doubt. "Or am I just a collection of memories? A walking, talking artifact?" "You're more than that," Evelyn said. "You're a man. A good man. A man who cares. A man who fights for what he believes is right." He turned away from the mirror, his gaze fixed on her face. "You see something in me," he said. "Something that I don't see in myself." "I see you," Evelyn said, her voice trembling slightly. "I see the man beneath the scars. The man beneath the immortality. The man I love." He stared at her, his eyes widening slightly, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. Then, a slow smile spread across his lips, a smile that reached his eyes, transforming his features. "You love me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Evelyn nodded, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "Yes," she said. "I do." He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a tenderness that made her heart melt. "I don't know what to say," he said. "I haven't felt this way in centuries. I thought I had forgotten how." "It's all right," Evelyn said, her voice soothing. "You don't have to say anything. Just feel it." He leaned in and kissed her, his lips soft and gentle at first, then deepening with a passion that took her breath away. Evelyn responded, her arms wrapping around his neck, her body pressing against his. It was a kiss that transcended time, a kiss that erased the centuries, a kiss that connected two souls. The mirror, forgotten on the wall, reflected their embrace, a fleeting image of two lovers caught in a moment of impossible happiness. But the reflection was distorted. The cracked glass fragmented the image, creating a mosaic of broken pieces. A foreshadowing, a warning, of the dangers that still lay ahead, of the fragility of their love, of the inevitable separation that awaited them. As they broke the kiss, a sudden, loud noise shattered the silence. The sound of breaking glass, of splintering wood. They were under attack. Calloway instantly pushed Evelyn behind him, his hand reaching for the knife beneath his coat. Chapter 16. The Weight of Oaths. Soldiers burst through the door and windows, their rifles aimed, their faces grim. Leading them was Lieutenant Dubois, his expression triumphant, a cruel smile playing on his lips. "Well, well, well," Dubois said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Look what we have here. The fugitive and his whore." Calloway stood his ground, his body shielding Evelyn, his eyes fixed on Dubois, his hand tight on the hilt of his knife. "You won't get away with this, Dubois," Calloway said, his voice low and menacing. "I have proof of your treachery. I have the map." Dubois laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "The map?" he scoffed. "That pathetic forgery? You think anyone will believe you? A deserter? A traitor? An immortal freak?" He gestured to the soldiers. "Take them," he ordered. "And this time, make sure they don't escape." The soldiers moved forward, their rifles pointed at Calloway and Evelyn. Evelyn felt a surge of fear, of despair. It was over. They had failed. But Calloway didn't surrender. He lunged forward, his knife flashing in the dim light, his movements swift and deadly. He engaged the soldiers, fighting with a ferocity that belied his weary soul. He was a whirlwind of motion, a blur of steel and muscle. He moved with a speed and agility that was unnatural, his centuries of experience honed to a razor's edge. He disarmed one soldier, knocked another unconscious, and sent a third sprawling to the floor. But there were too many of them. They surrounded him, their rifles pressing against his body, their bayonets glinting in the flickering light. "Enough!" Du Bois shouted. "Hold him. I want him alive.
For now."
The soldiers wrestled Calloway to the ground, pinning his arms behind his back, his face pressed against the dusty floor. He struggled, his muscles straining, but it was no use. He was captured. Du Bois approached him, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating hatred. He knelt down beside Calloway, his face inches from his.
"You should have stayed dead," Du Bois hissed.
"You should have rotted in the ground, like all the other monsters." He reached out and snatched the satchel from Calloway's shoulder, the satchel containing the alchemist's journal and the map. He opened it, his fingers rummaging inside. "Where is it?" he demanded. "Where is the map?" Calloway didn't answer. He just stared at Du Bois, his eyes filled with a mixture of defiance and despair. Du Bois emptied the contents of the satchel onto the floor, scattering the papers and the book. He picked up the map, his eyes widening slightly as he examined it. "What's this?" he muttered, his fingers tracing the small, almost imperceptible symbol. "What is this mark?" He looked at Calloway, his expression confused, then suspicious. He realized Evelyn saw that something was wrong, that the map was not what he thought it was. You knew," Du Bois said, his voice trembling with rage. "You knew about the code. You set me up." He stood up, his face contorted with fury. He raised his hand, his fingers forming a fist. "You will pay for this," he said, his voice shaking. "You will suffer. You will beg for death." He brought his fist down, striking Calloway across the face. Evelyn cried out, struggling against the soldiers who held her back.
"Stop it,"
she screamed. "Leave him alone." Du Bois ignored her. He continued to beat Calloway, his blows landing with a sickening thud. Calloway didn't cry out. He didn't flinch. He just endured. Evelyn watched in horror, her heart breaking with every blow. She knew that Calloway could heal, that the injuries would vanish. But the pain, the humiliation, the injustice, it was unbearable. Finally, Du Bois stopped, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his face flushed with anger. He looked at Calloway, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating hatred. He spoke to the soldiers holding Evelyn. "Take her away. Keep her confined, and away from him." He turned again to face Calloway. "As for you, I have special plans in store." Evelyn was dragged away. Her final view of Calloway was of his bloody and bruised face. The soldiers threw Evelyn in a locked and windowless room. She pounded her fist on the door, praying that someone, anyone, would find her. Chapter 17. A Revelation in the Rain. Evelyn spent hours in the locked room, the darkness pressing in on her, her mind racing with fear and despair. She had no idea where she was, what had happened to Calloway, or what Du Bois planned to do with them. She paced the small space, her footsteps echoing in the silence, her hands clenching and unclenching, her thoughts a chaotic jumble of prayers and curses. She tried to focus on the positive, on the hope that the network would find them, that Madame Sophie would rescue them. But the fear gnawed at her, whispering doubts and uncertainties, painting grim scenarios in her mind. She thought of Calloway, of his strength, his resilience, his love. She remembered his kiss, the warmth of his embrace, the tenderness in his eyes. She clung to those memories, drawing strength from them, refusing to give up hope. As the hours passed, the darkness outside began to lift, a faint gray light filtering through the cracks in the door. Evelyn heard sounds, muffled voices, footsteps, the distant rumble of vehicles. She pressed her ear against the door, trying to make out what was happening. She heard a familiar voice, a voice that made her heart leap with hope. It was Dr. Dubois. He was arguing with someone, his voice raised in anger. "You can't do this," he shouted. "He's a prisoner of war. He's under my care. You have no authority." Evelyn realized that Lieutenant Dubois must have brought Calloway back to the hospital, perhaps to torture him further, or to experiment on him. She had to do something. She had to escape. She had to help him. She examined the door, searching for a weakness, a flaw, a way to break free. It was a solid wooden door, reinforced with iron bars, secured with a heavy lock. It was impregnable. But then she noticed something. The hinges. They were old and rusty, their screws loose and corroded. They were vulnerable. She looked around the room, searching for something to use as a tool, a weapon, anything that could help her pry the hinges loose. There was nothing. Just the bare walls, the dirt floor, and the single, flickering candle that provided the only source of light. Then she remembered the amulet. Madame Sophie's amulet. The silver crescent moon. She pulled it out from beneath her dress, her fingers closing around it tightly. It was small, delicate, but it was made of strong metal. It might work. She knelt down beside the door, her heart pounding in her chest. She inserted the amulet into the gap between the hinge and the door frame, using it as a lever, applying pressure, trying to loosen the screws. It was slow, painstaking work. The screws were stubborn, resisting her efforts, the metal of the amulet bending slightly under the strain. But she persisted, her hands aching, her muscles burning, her determination fueled by love and desperation. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she felt one of the screws give way, popping loose with a satisfying click. She moved on to the next one, and the next, her hopes rising with each small victory. As she worked, the sounds outside intensified. She heard more voices, more footsteps, the sound of struggle. She realized that Dr. Dubois was resisting Dubois' men, trying to protect Calloway. She had to hurry. She had to get out of there, before it was too late. Finally, the last screw gave way, and the hinge came loose, the door sagging slightly. Evelyn pushed against it, her shoulders straining, her muscles screaming. The door creaked open, just enough for her to squeeze through. She slipped out of the room, her heart pounding in her chest, her body trembling with adrenaline. She found herself in a narrow corridor, dimly lit by flickering lanterns. She could hear the sounds of fighting, coming from the end of the corridor. She ran towards the sound, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She turned a corner, and she saw a scene that made her blood run cold. Dr. Dubois was struggling with two soldiers, his face bruised and bloody, his clothes torn. He was trying to protect Calloway, who was lying on the floor, unconscious, his body covered in wounds. Lieutenant Dubois stood over Calloway, a cruel smile on his lips, a pistol in his hand. He was about to shoot him.
To kill him. No.
Evelyn screamed, her voice echoing through the corridor. Dubois turned, his eyes widening in surprise, then narrowing with anger. He raised the pistol, aiming it at Evelyn. But before he could fire, a figure emerged from the shadows, a figure that moved with a speed and agility that was unnatural. It was Calloway. He had healed. He had recovered. He lunged at Dubois, tackling him to the ground, the pistol flying from his grasp. They wrestled, their bodies locked in a desperate struggle, their faces contorted with rage. Evelyn ran towards them, her heart pounding in her chest. She had to help Calloway. She had to stop Dubois. But as she reached them, Dubois managed to free himself from Calloway's grip. He grabbed the pistol from the floor, his eyes filled with a cold, calculating hatred. He aimed it at Calloway, his finger tightening on the trigger. Evelyn knew that it was over, that Calloway was going to die. But then, a shot rang out, a loud, deafening explosion that echoed through the corridor. Dubois staggered, his eyes widening in surprise, his hand clutching his chest. He looked down, his fingers brushing against the spreading stain of blood. He collapsed to the floor, his body limp, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. He was dead. Evelyn looked around, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind reeling. Who had fired the shot? Who had saved Calloway? Standing behind them was Dr. Dubois. He was holding a pistol, the barrel smoked lightly. The sound of rain hitting the canvas roof intensified, washing over all. Chapter 18. The Price of Immortality. The rain poured down outside, a torrential downpour that mirrored the chaos and turmoil inside the hospital. Dr. Dubois stood, his hand still gripping the pistol, his face pale and drawn, his eyes filled with a mixture of shock and relief. Calloway slowly got to his feet, his body bruised and battered, but his wounds healing. He looked at Dubois, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said, his voice low. Dubois nodded, his gaze fixed on the lifeless body of Lieutenant Dubois. He was going to kill you," he said, his voice trembling. "I had no choice." Evelyn ran to Calloway, her arms wrapping around him, her body trembling with relief. He held her close, his hands stroking her hair, his cheek resting against hers. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "I am now," he said, his voice soft. "Thanks to you. And to Dr. Dubois." They stood there for a moment, locked in an embrace, the rain drumming against the canvas roof, the silence broken only by their ragged breathing and the dripping of blood. Then, Calloway gently pulled away, his gaze fixed on Dr. Dubois.
"We need to leave," he said.
"We need to get out of here. Before more soldiers come." Dubois nodded, his expression grim. "I know," he said. "I have prepared everything. There's a vehicle waiting outside. It will take you to Paris." He explained that he had anticipated Dubois' actions, and he had made arrangements for their escape. He had contacted the network, and they had provided him with a truck, a driver, and false documents. "You risked your life for us," Evelyn said, her voice filled with gratitude. Dubois smiled sadly. "I did what I had to do," he said. "I could not let that monster harm you."
"Or Calloway."
He looked at Calloway, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and pity. "You are a good man, Captain," he said. "Despite what you are. Despite what you have done." Calloway nodded, his expression somber. "I know," he said. "And I will spend the rest of my existence trying to make amends. Trying to atone for my sins." They left the hospital, slipping out into the darkness and the rain. Dubois led them to a covered truck, parked behind the building, hidden from view. A driver, a young man with a determined expression, was waiting for them. "Take them to Paris," Dubois said. "To Madame Sophie. She will know what to do." The driver nodded, his eyes fixed on Calloway, a flicker of recognition and respect in his gaze. Calloway and Evelyn climbed into the back of the truck, the space cramped and dark, the air thick with the scent of petrol and damp canvas. They sat close together, their bodies touching, their hands clasped tightly. As the truck started, its engine sputtering to life, Evelyn looked back at Dr. Dubois, his figure silhouetted against the flickering light of the hospital entrance. He raised his hand, a silent farewell, a gesture of solidarity. The truck pulled away, its wheels splashing through the puddles, its headlights cutting through the darkness and the rain. Evelyn and Calloway were on their way to Paris, to safety, to a new beginning. But the journey was far from over. They still had to expose Dubois' treachery. They still had to clear Calloway's name. And they still had to face the challenges, the dangers, that awaited them. As they traveled, Calloway began to talk, his voice low and hesitant. He told Evelyn about his past, about his long and tumultuous life, about the wars he had fought, the loves he had lost, the sins he had committed. He spoke of the burden of immortality, of the endless cycle of death and rebirth, of the constant struggle to retain his humanity, to resist the darkness that threatened to consume him. "It's a curse, Evelyn," he said, his voice filled with a profound sadness. "A curse disguised as a gift. It isolates you. It separates you. From everyone. From everything. But you're not alone," Evelyn said, her voice soothing. "You have me. And you have the network. You have friends. People who care about you." He smiled faintly. "Yes," he said. "I do. And that means everything. It gives me hope. It gives me strength. To keep fighting. To keep living." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a love that transcended time, a love that defied the boundaries of mortality and immortality. "You have changed me, Evelyn," he said. "You have reminded me of what it means to be human, of what it means to love, of what it means to live." Evelyn leaned her head against his shoulder, her heart filled with a mixture of joy and sorrow. She knew that their love was doomed, that their time together was limited, but she didn't care. She would cherish every moment, every second that they had. She would love him with all her heart, with all her soul, for as long as she could. The truck rumbled on, and the rain continued to fall. A cleansing rain, washing the blood, the mud and grime from the world, or at least attempting to. Chapter 19. Where the Heart Lies. Paris was a city of shadows and secrets, a city of whispers and clandestine meetings. The network, operating in the hidden corners of the city, provided Calloway and Evelyn with a safe haven, a small apartment tucked away in a quiet, unassuming neighborhood. They were safe for the moment, but they knew that their enemies were still out there, searching for them, plotting against them. Madame Sophie, the leader of the Paris network, greeted them with warmth and understanding. She listened to their story, examined the alchemist's journal and the forged map, and assured them that she would do everything in her power to help them. "We have allies," she said, her voice firm. "In high places, in the military, in the government. We will expose Dubois' treachery. We will clear Calloway's name. We will bring him justice." But it wouldn't be easy. Dubois had powerful connections, and he had covered his tracks well. The network needed time to gather evidence, to build a case, to prepare their strategy. Calloway and Evelyn were forced to wait, to live in hiding, their days filled with a mixture of anxiety and anticipation. They spent their time poring over the alchemist's journal, trying to decipher its secrets, hoping to find something, anything, that could help them. The journal was a fascinating and disturbing document, a record of one man's obsession with immortality, his relentless pursuit of eternal life. The alchemist had experimented with various potions, rituals, and incantations, drawing upon ancient texts and forbidden knowledge. He had documented his failures, his frustrations, his madness. He had described his encounters with the others, with other immortals, some of whom had embraced the darkness, some of whom had retained their humanity. He had written of Calloway, of his transformation, of his unique condition. He had speculated on the reasons for his success, on the factors that had made Calloway different. He believed it was a combination of things, Calloway said, his voice low, as he translated a passage from the journal. "My physical constitution, my mental state, my will to live, and the specific circumstances of my wounding, the timing, the location, the alignment of the stars." Evelyn listened, her heart filled with a mixture of fascination and horror. She was learning more and more about Calloway's past, about the forces that had shaped him, about the burden he carried. She was also learning more about herself, about her own strength, her own resilience, her own capacity for love. She had faced dangers, overcome obstacles, and risked her life for a man she barely knew, a man who was different, a man who was immortal. And she had done it all for love, for the love that had blossomed in the midst of war, in the shadow of death, in the heart of a ruined world. As the days turned into weeks, Calloway and Evelyn's bond deepened. They shared their hopes, their fears, their dreams. They talked of the future, of a life beyond the war, of a world where they could be together. But they also knew that their future was uncertain, that their love was fragile, that their time together was limited. One evening, as they were sitting by the window, watching the city lights twinkle in the darkness, Calloway turned to Evelyn, his eyes filled with a profound sadness. "I have been thinking," he said, his voice low, "about us, about our future." Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She knew what he was going to say. "I cannot ask you to share my life," he continued. "It is not a life. It is an existence. A long, lonely journey, filled with pain and loss. But I love you," Evelyn said, her voice trembling. "I don't care about immortality. I don't care about the past. I just want to be with you. And I love you," Calloway said, his voice filled with emotion. More than anything. More than life itself. But I cannot be selfish. I cannot condemn you to this. He explained that he had been thinking about the alchemist's journal, about the possibility of reversing the process, of becoming mortal again.
He wrote about it, Calloway said.
He speculated on the possibility. He believed it could be done. But he never tried. He was too afraid. Of death. And you're not afraid? Evelyn asked, her voice hushed. Calloway smiled faintly. I am, he said. But I am more afraid. Of losing you. Of watching you grow old. Of seeing you die. While I live on. He told her that he wanted to try. He wanted to find a way to become mortal again. To live a normal life. To grow old with her. To die with her. Evelyn was stunned. She had never considered the possibility. She had accepted his immortality. She had embraced it. But now he was offering her a choice. A chance. To be together. In a normal way. Is it possible? She asked, her voice trembling. Can it really be done?
I don't know, Calloway said. But I have to try.
For you. For us. Evelyn knew it was dangerous and could kill him. But she also knew that she couldn't stand in the way of his decision. The journal sat on the table, open to a page filled with complex diagrams and a list of strange ingredients. Chapter 20. The Reckoning of Time. The decision made, a new kind of tension filled their hidden sanctuary. It was no longer the fear of capture, but the looming specter of Calloway's mortality, a concept both terrifying and profoundly hopeful. They began to work, meticulously following the alchemist's cryptic instructions, gathering the rare and obscure ingredients listed in the journal. Madame Sophie and the network provided invaluable assistance, their contacts reaching far and wide, procuring items that seemed almost impossible to find in war-torn Europe. The process was arduous, requiring patience, precision, and a deep understanding of the alchemist's esoteric knowledge. Calloway, despite his centuries of life, had never delved deeply into the magical arts. He had been a soldier, a warrior, not a scholar. But he was driven now by a force more powerful than any army love. Evelyn, with her scientific mind and her nursing experience, proved to be an indispensable partner. She understood the principles of chemistry and biology, and she was able to interpret some of the alchemist's more obscure pronouncements, translating them into practical steps. They worked day and night, their small apartment transformed into a makeshift laboratory, filled with strange herbs, bubbling concoctions, and the ever-present scent of incense and arcane chemicals. They faced setbacks, frustrations, and moments of doubt. But they persevered, their love for each other fueling their determination. Finally, after weeks of relentless effort, they were ready. They had prepared the potion, the elixir, that they hoped would reverse the process of immortality, that would make Calloway mortal again. It was a clear, shimmering liquid, contained in a small, crystal vial. It glowed faintly in the dim light, emitting a subtle warmth, a sense of power. It was beautiful and terrifying. Calloway held the vial in his hand, his fingers trembling slightly. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. Are you sure about this? He asked, his voice low. Evelyn nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. I am, she said. I'm sure. She knew that it was a risk, a gamble, that it could kill him. But she also knew that it was his choice, his decision, and she would support him, no matter what. I love you, Evelyn, Calloway said, his voice filled with emotion. More than anything, more than life itself. And I love you, Calloway, Evelyn said, her voice trembling. More than words can say. He raised the vial to his lips, his eyes closing. He took a deep breath, and then he drank. The liquid flowed down his throat, a sensation of fire and ice, of power and weakness. He felt a jolt of energy, a surge of pain. His body trembled, his muscles spasmed, his heart raced. He gasped, his eyes flying open, his gaze fixed on Evelyn. He felt different. He felt strange. He felt weak. He collapsed to his knees, his body shaking uncontrollably. Evelyn rushed to his side, her arms wrapping around him, her heart filled with terror. Calloway,
she cried.
What's happening? Are you all right? He didn't answer. He just shivered, his body racked with spasms, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Evelyn feared the worst. She feared that the potion had failed, that it had killed him. But then, slowly, gradually, the shaking subsided. The spasms ceased. His breathing evened out. He opened his eyes, his gaze focusing on Evelyn. He looked different. He looked younger. He looked mortal. I think it worked, he said, his voice weak but clear. Evelyn felt a surge of relief, of joy, of unbelievable happiness. He was alive. He was mortal. He was hers. But their celebration was short-lived. A sudden, loud banging on the door shattered the silence, followed by shouts and the sound of breaking wood. The authorities. They had found them. Calloway struggled to his feet, his body still weak, his movements unsteady. He looked at Evelyn, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination.
"We need to go," he said.
"We need to escape." But it was too late. The door burst open, and soldiers stormed into the apartment, their rifles aimed, their faces grim. Leading them was not Du Bois, for he was dead, but a high-ranking officer, a general, his uniform immaculate, his expression cold and calculating. "James Calloway," the general said, his voice harsh. "You are under arrest. For desertion.
For espionage.
For crimes against nature." Calloway didn't resist. He just stood there, his head held high, his eyes fixed on the general, his hand clasped tightly in Evelyn's. "I am innocent," he said, his voice firm. "Of all charges. Except the last. I was a crime against nature. But I am no longer." The general stared at him, his expression confused, then suspicious. He gestured to the soldiers. "Take him," he ordered. "And her. We will sort this out later." As the soldiers moved forward, Madame Sophie and members of the network appeared in the doorway, surrounding the soldiers. The final showdown had begun. Epilogue. The standoff in the cramped apartment was a whirlwind of chaos and confusion. Madame Sophie and her network fighters, though outnumbered, were fierce and determined, their loyalty to Calloway and Evelyn unwavering. The soldiers, caught off guard by the sudden resistance, hesitated, their orders conflicting with the unexpected reality. The general, however, remained unfazed. He drew his own pistol, his eyes cold and calculating, his focus entirely on Calloway. "You may have tricked us," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "You may have fooled us. With your potion. With your pretended mortality. But you will not escape justice." He raised his pistol, aiming it directly at Calloway's heart. Evelyn screamed, throwing herself in front of Calloway, shielding him with her body. But before the general could fire, a shot rang out, not from his pistol, but from somewhere else. The general staggered, his eyes widening in surprise, his hand clutching his chest. He collapsed to the floor, his body limp, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Silence descended upon the room, a silence broken only by the sound of rain drumming against the windows. Everyone looked around, confused, searching for the source of the shot. Standing in the doorway, a smoking pistol in her hand, was Marie. The young nurse, her face pale and drawn, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. She had followed them. She had tracked them down. She had saved them. "I couldn't let him hurt you," she stammered, her voice trembling. I know the truth.
Now.
I believe you." Evelyn rushed to her, embracing her, her heart filled with gratitude and relief. Calloway, still weak, but recovering, joined them, his arm around both of them. The soldiers, leaderless and confused, surrendered, their weapons clattering to the floor. Madame Sophie and her network fighters took control, securing the apartment, ensuring their safety. The aftermath was a blur of activity. The general's death was investigated, Marie's testimony was heard, and the truth, slowly but surely, began to emerge. The network, with its powerful allies, worked tirelessly to expose Du Bois' treachery, to clear Calloway's name, and to bring justice to those who had wronged him. Calloway, now mortal, was no longer a threat to the authorities. He was just a man. A man who had served his country, a man who had suffered, a man who had loved. He and Evelyn were finally free. Free to live their lives. Free to be together. Free to grow old. Together. They left Paris, leaving behind the shadows and secrets, the dangers and the uncertainties. They returned to the small French village, to the field hospital, to the place where their love had begun. They rebuilt their lives, working side by side, tending to the wounded, caring for the sick, offering comfort and hope to those who had suffered. They lived a simple life, a quiet life, a normal life. Calloway, no longer burdened by immortality, embraced his mortality with a grace and a gratitude that touched everyone who knew him. He aged slowly, gracefully, his hair turning gray, his face becoming lined, his body weakening. But his eyes remained the same. The same deep sea on a stormy day, the same intensity, the same love. Evelyn remained by his side, her love for him unwavering, her devotion unbreakable. They shared their days, their nights, their dreams. They watched the seasons change, the years pass, the world move on. And then, one day, many years later, Calloway, now an old man, lay dying in his bed, his body frail and weak, his breath shallow. Evelyn sat beside him, holding his hand, her tears falling onto his weathered skin. "I love you, Evelyn," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "More than anything. More than life itself." "And I love you, Calloway," Evelyn said, her voice choked with emotion. "Always. And forever." He smiled faintly, his eyes closing. He took a final breath, and then he was gone. Evelyn, heartbroken but at peace, buried him in the small churchyard, beside the ruined church where their love had first blossomed. She placed a single poppy on his grave, a symbol of remembrance, of sacrifice, of love. She lived on for a few more years, her heart filled with memories, her soul connected to his. And then, one day, she too passed away, peacefully, in her sleep. She was buried beside him, their graves marked by simple stone crosses, their names etched together, their love eternal. The war had ended long ago. The world had changed. But their love remained. A testament to the power of the human heart, a beacon of hope in a world of darkness, a story whispered on the wind. A story of a soldier who didn't bleed and a nurse who loved him. The end.